4 years ago, a beautiful 29-year-old newlywed named Brittany Maynard became international news when her story went public. Brittany was diagnosed with the most aggressive and lethal form of brain cancer, a stage 4 glioblastoma. Knowing that her death would involve relentless pain and suffering, Brittany decided to take control of her own dying process. Brittany's wish was that Americans could have control of their own dying process in all 50 states, and she spent the final weeks of her life advocating for this. Her husband, Dan, has continued the fight since she passed.
I'm Tara Marie, and I'm a fitness expert, personal trainer, and motivational strategist. Optimal health is achieved when you're balanced mentally, emotionally, physically, socially, and spiritually. My goal is to bring you information that will help you be the best version of you.
Welcome my guest, everyone, Dan Diaz. Dan works with a nonprofit organization called Compassion and Choices. He advocates for expanding the availability of end-of-life options for terminally ill people. His efforts were instrumental in securing the passage of legislation in California, Colorado, and Washington, D.C. And he continues his work across the country, keeping the promise he made to Brittany. Dan, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
It's so nice to have you back. This is actually the third time we've spoken. People who listened when I was on SiriusXM already know you from those shows. I interviewed you on February 27th, 2015, which was 4 months after Brittany passed.
Yeah.
And then again on December 16th, 2015. So we did a 1 year later show, and then now we're happy to have you back for actually a 4 year later show to get word on everything you've been doing. How are you doing now?
Well, legislatively speaking, you provided the summary there. We've passed this law now in California, Colorado, D.C., and just a few months ago, Hawaii became the 8th state. So the idea that we have made that much progress in just 4 years, because before Brittany died, there were only 4 states, Oregon, Washington, Vermont, and Montana, that allowed a terminally ill individual this option. And so now, since Brittany's death, the idea that we're up to 8 states, that to me is very meaningful, because that's the very promise that I made to her, that I would work on this legislation so that nobody else would ever have to leave their home like we did after being told you have 6 months to live. From a work perspective, we're keeping that promise to Brittany.
Yes.
That feels good that we've made those strides. From a personal perspective, I miss Brittany every day, and especially just what I think when I think back to everything that she had to endure. The chaos of that brain tumor. The emotion is still there.
I understand. And this, by the way, we should acknowledge that at the time of this pre-recording of this podcast, this is the night before.
Correct. Tomorrow, November 1st, will mark the 4 years since Brittany died. She died November 1st, 2014.
And you know that I was thrilled when you told me you were going to be in New York working on legislation, and we'll get into that. When I posted about it on my Facebook page, and I've already showed you this, I just want people to understand this is a very controversial issue, and the reason I'm so happy to have you here is because I feel like by putting a human story to a piece of legislation, that's the only way to really get people to understand it beyond a piece of legislation. And I shared this with you before. I shared that you were coming, and this story, and people still remember it. And Jan on Facebook said, "No, I cannot listen to this broadcast. I believe that God gives and God takes. It's not in our hands to end our own lives."
Yeah, and I would say that for those individuals who have never personally been in Brittany's predicament, or even a loved one who is caring for a person who is navigating, something like that brain tumor, it's that individual may have a change of heart if they were ever to find themselves in Brittany's predicament, and then recognize what this program is really about, which is simply that there comes a point in certain cases where modern medicine is no longer able to keep a person from suffering at end of life. There's no amount of morphine that's going to, Brittany was already suffering from pain that not even morphine could alleviate. It was this constant pressure at the base of her skull, the seizure, the nausea. That idea that we somehow have to suffer at end of life. As a Catholic,
Yeah.
I was an altar boy, went to Catholic school. The bishop of the Oakland Diocese, Bishop John Cummings, presented me with the Ad Altare Dei Award, which is an award for service in your Catholic community. So through and through, as a Catholic, I can say that I have no issues whatsoever reconciling that my faith, along with the idea that Brittany, taking back that little bit of control and having a gentle dying process, I have no issue reconciling those two things.
Right.
And so, as much as religion for an individual will play a role in the decisions that they're making for themselves, and I totally respect that. I would just say that if those individuals were to find themselves in Brittany's predicament, they might think of it a little bit differently.
Or their child, or
Exactly.
their husband.
Their loved
'Cause
one.
as you know, and I know this from watching my mom, it's equally as horrific to watch someone suffer
Yeah.
as it is to be the person suffering.
Yeah, there were many conversations that I had with Brittany where she would see the look on my face of just, if she was feeling nauseous or vomiting or whatever she was suffering from, or had just had a seizure, and she would mention, Dan, it seems like based on the expression on your face, you might be processing this, or this might be harder for me in those moments. And
Right.
because she knows how much pain she's experiencing and what she's going through. For me, I'm just always thinking that her pain level is at a 10,
Yeah.
and so yes, the loved ones, the family, you suffer right along with them. The strength of this legislation, so the response to
Jan,
the audience, to Jan, would simply be that the strength of this is that it's an option.
Right.
So once this legislation passes, if there are individuals who are opposed to it, and if they were to find themselves in Brittany's predicament, they would simply never avail themselves of the option.
Right.
They would never apply for it. So it's entirely voluntary. A person has to pursue this for themselves.
Right.
And so for Jan, who says that she's opposed, then this law does not affect her whatsoever. She
Right.
would simply never have that conversation with the doctor, and that's that.
Right. And I wanted to tell you that because that posted relatively quickly, and I thought it was very telling about what you must encounter on a daily basis in your work. Now, I know that Brittany's dying wish, as we've already said, was that you continue the work that she did. In her very last weeks of life, she, instead of kicking back and just chilling and doing what she really wanted to do, she really dedicated herself to helping other people that she knew would need the help after she was gone. So her dying wish was that you would carry on her work of having it be so that no one ever had to go without control of their own dying process. I imagine that doing this work, because I know you started it full time in July of 2015, has really helped you cope.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of therapy in it for me. Keeping that promise to Brittany, it's the way that I honor her and honor her legacy. And so, yes, for me, that is very meaningful and important. This conversation that she started has made a huge impact on the conversation pertaining to end-of-life care.
Yeah.
And it goes well beyond just medical aid in dying. To be clear, Brittany's message was much broader than that. Her message was that end-of-life care as a whole, more emphasis needs to be placed on family members just having simple conversations with your loved one, filling out an advanced healthcare directive, just putting down on paper, if I was to find myself in a predicament where I'm unconscious, unable to make decisions for myself, what should my family members do? And what would I want them to do for me? Do I want to be hooked up to a ventilator and have all kind of extraordinary medical procedures being performed, hydration, artificial nutrition and everything? Or For some people, it's like, no, I'm in my 80s or 90s. I've lived my life. If I'm in that predicament, that it's okay to let me go peacefully, gently, without all those extraordinary, measures taking place. So that was really Brittany's message was broad, and the media, they focused on medical aid in dying because that's what they could sensationalize. And I understand. I get it, and I understand why there was so much attention paid to that. But in my work, your question, the answer to your question is yes. I find a certain amount of comfort, and like I said, therapy, that when I share Brittany's story, and then people start to understand the reality of what this program is, the safeguards that are in place. I've spoken at universities, at palliative care conferences, and when I make those presentations, I can see the change in the audience where all of a sudden they recognize, oh, wait, that's what we're talking about? I'm on board with that. Each one of them is as if they're kind of thinking, if I was in Brittany's predicament, I don't know that I'd use the option, but I'd certainly want to know that I have that option. Right. That option belongs to me.
And as I told you before we went to air, that I watched the president of Compassion and Choices, her TEDx talk, Barbara Coombs Lee.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And at the end, I thought it was very powerful. She said, this is really about taking the power out of the hands of the providers and putting it in the hands of the patients. That's all it's about.
That's right.
It's about saying the patient, because as Barbara said, she said, when you're dying, when you're at the end of your life and you're dying, it's about priorities. And it's about, it comes down, it boils down to priorities. And really, the priority should be the dying person,
the patient. Right, that's exactly right. It's not a child or a niece or a granddaughter or somebody giving direction. My role with Brittany as her husband is to listen to what is important to her, and she's the only one with that tumor in her skull. She's the only one experiencing the pain and suffering through the symptoms. Forget even the horrific symptoms that the cancer is causing. Sometimes the side effects of the medications that they prescribe to an individual, those can be horrific. So, the role of the family, the loved ones, is to support that individual. The focus has to be on that terminally ill individual. Yeah. And so, yes, Barbara Coombs Lee in that TEDx summarizes it perfectly, that truly is a bit of a shift away from doctor knows best to, no, this needs to be a collaborative effort where it's the patient that is listened to.
Patient-centric, yeah.
Yes, and the physicians round that out and provide that, that level of care for the patient.
Right. Now, speaking about Brittany and her symptoms, take us through the timeline from Brittany's diagnosis on January 1st of 2014, ultimately then to her death on November 1st of 2014, and even before that, I know you got married in September of 2012. So,
right. And this, I appreciate the opportunity to share this with your audience because it usually provides more than just those 20-second sound bites that were circulating in the media 4 years ago, and inevitably there's misinformation out there. So yes, Brittany and I we met in 2007 actually. We were engaged and got married in September of 2012, and we'd bought a house and just started settling into our lives together. A few months after our wedding, Brittany started having headaches that would wake her up in the middle of the night. She was getting sick, start vomiting, and be unable to go back to sleep. That went on for a few months, and by the end of that year, so now this is the end of 2013, it was actually New Year's Eve, so on December 31st, 2013, I had to take Brittany to the emergency room because the pain was just getting too intense that day, and something just seemed terribly wrong. And it was like 2 a.m. the following morning, transferred her to a different hospital, but we finally got an MRI, and that's when they discovered that Brittany had that brain tumor, that it was very large, and that there was no cure. Just 10 days after that, Brittany had she endured an 8-hour brain surgery at UCSF Medical Center. And that was simply to debulk. Essentially, it was to remove the tumor material that they could safely get to in order to create enough space in her skull so that the current symptoms that she was suffering from would subside. At that point, they told Brittany that 3 to 5 years was the life expectancy that she had.
Okay.
And mind you, she's 29 years old. Unfortunately, just 2 months later, at the first follow-up MRI, the tumor showed signs that it was growing aggressively, indicative of a glioblastoma multiforme. And they then informed Brittany that 6 months was all the time she had left. That term GBM, recent events highlight that it doesn't matter if your name is Senator John McCain or Ted Kennedy or Beau Biden or Brittany Maynard. A GBM, unfortunately, is terribly efficient at killing people. Or ending the life of a terminally ill individual. That diagnosis, the average life expectancy is 14 months. In Brittany's case, for her, it was 10 months that she lived with it. I had an individual reach out to me on Facebook just recently, and her husband just died actually about 3 nights ago. And for him, from diagnosis till the day he died was about 3.5 months. So it can be extremely aggressive. But, Brittany was determined to live, and we researched every treatment option that was available at the time. That was both here in the United States as well as internationally. But unfortunately, the tumor was growing aggressively, and the standard treatments of chemotherapy and radiation, those might give her 2 or 3 months on the back end, but she would start feeling the harsh side effects of those treatments immediately. So, that was a decision, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, that she was making as far as what treatment she would agree to pursue, because it does come to a question of quality of life.
Right. Not
just suffering through days, but actually the ability to live through them. I remember there was a day, and this was early on, when Brittany said to me, I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid of death. Death does not have that power over me anymore. And I knew those words weren't just lip service. She did not fear death. But I am afraid of suffering, she said, especially since I will die anyway. I would prefer to die gently, not struggling and in pain. So early on, Brittany brought up the topic of medical aid in dying. And at that time, it had been available in Oregon for 16 years, but it was not available in our home state of California. And just to explain so the audience understands the parameters of this program, 2 physicians independent of one another have to agree that that this individual is terminally ill. They have 6 months or less to live. That person has to be mentally competent. They make the request both verbally and in writing. There's a 15-day waiting period. In between the requests, there are witnesses involved. These are the safeguards, and Brittany felt incredibly protected going through this process. So those are the parameters of the program. But at times I get the question, well, what might be the reasons for pursuing it? And I touched on this a little bit already, but for Brittany, the fear of being tortured to death, if that tumor was allowed to run its course, that was the one thing that terrified her. It had already been explained to us by her medical team, and a simple search on the internet will give you a list of the horrific symptoms that a person with a brain tumor might endure as they are dying. But on top of that, both Brittany and I, we each had a friend whose parent, one died of a GBM, the other of a stage 3 brain cancer. So we knew firsthand what was coming for Brittany. And that included pain that not even morphine would lead. Dilaudid is 4 times stronger than morphine.
Okay.
And Brittany was on some pretty hefty doses of Dilaudid. Personality changes where 1 minute the individual seems normal, The next minute, they might be agitated, cruel, or violent. Seizures that become increasingly frequent and severe. The mild seizures would leave her unable to speak typically for 20 to 30 minutes afterwards.
Yeah.
If she suffered the full grand mal seizures, and she had a few of those would leave her exhausted typically through the following day, many times with blood coming out of her mouth because she's bitten through part of her tongue. That's just the reality of what she's living with. But, it gets worse. The probability that she would go blind as the tumor grows and puts pressure on different parts of the brain, the likelihood that she would lose the ability to speak and communicate altogether, because it's not uncommon for a person with a brain tumor to suffer a stroke.
Okay.
Depending on what part of the brain is damaged due to the lack of oxygen during the stroke, the individual could lose motor function, the ability to stand, walk, swallow. Partial paralysis is likely, complete paralysis a possibility, and that's when Brittany said, I will not die that way. Why should I be forced to? I mention that just because any assertion that we're able to control pain in 100% of the cases at end of life, that's simply not true. Mm-hmm. That would be irresponsible and a reckless claim. I can line up scores of physicians and palliative care nurses and hospice care nurses that they admit that we've gotten pretty good, but there are specific cases where that is not the case. A person still does suffer at end of life, and it's that paternalistic view of a doctor telling you when you've suffered enough, and then they'll hook you up to a morphine drip and potentially die a terrifying death. That's where my wife Brittany, with just her personality and her determination, Brittany refused to accept that. She says, no, that she's not going to put in the hands of a physician. She says, that belongs to me, the patient.
I actually understand that you were the one who you started doing research on the internet, and you're the one who found the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon. Is that not true?
No, she was one who brought up. She'd actually taken a class when she was an undergrad in college.
Okay.
And it was something that had been talked about in that, in whatever college course, she graduated from UC Berkeley, whatever that course was. And so she brought it up, and we had that conversation pretty early on. And so, for me, I was the one doing some research, looking it up and trying to understand, okay, how is that? My immediate response, which is a lot of people's immediate response, is like, well, that's what hospice does. And Brittany was like, no, this is different. This is unique. This is a different program where, as the parameters that I mentioned, a person has to apply for, qualify for, and finally be granted that prescription. That process of that I mentioned, Brittany feeling incredibly protected. We had to move to Oregon. I took a leave of absence from work. Brittany found a house for us to rent on Craigslist. It's ridiculous. This is what we're doing after she's been told that she has 6 months to live. We found a new medical team, said goodbye to our friends and family, packed up half of our house into a U-Haul in California, and then drove 600 miles to Portland, Oregon. And that's where the reason Brittany spoke up is because she says nobody should have to go through this at end of life. And then once we were in Portland, that's when Brittany went through that very rigorous process of applying for and qualifying for the medication. But once she received it, she puts that medication in the cupboard and she focuses on living life. That's always the goal. Her focus is never on that medication. It's that, and if anything, having that medication, it really empowered her because she no longer had to be so fearful of how her dying process might go. Her passion of being outdoors and in nature. We went to Yellowstone National Park. She hiked glaciers in Alaska with a friend of hers, Sarah, who's a physician. We went to Olympic National Park in Washington, Hood River in Oregon. We got to do all of the things that mattered to Brittany.
Right.
Had she pursued the chemotherapy and the radiation, the physicians had already told us, they said, we're going to, because of the size of that tumor, they're going to have to radiate 2/3 to 3/4 of her brain. So they're saying, in addition to the scalp burns and the cognitive deficits, and you're not going to have the energy to go and do any of these things that you want to do. And then you throw in the chemotherapy, and it's like you're going to be throwing up. You won't feel like going for a hike. And that's where Brittany, and again, just her. It's one of those where I wish everyone had the opportunity to meet her, because it truly, there's just something about her personality and her outgoing spirit.
Yeah.
She's like, she was going to decide how things played out for her.
Well, and I hope people understand. One reason I'm glad you're telling this story is I think a lot of people don't understand that you guys considered traditional medical treatments. It's not like, like you said, she endured an 8-hour surgery. She tried.
Yeah, and actually that's a great point, because in addition to focusing on living life and doing the things that she wanted to, we sent her packet of medical information to every clinical trial that offered any glimmer of hope. Okay. So, we're researching everything we can to see about extending her life. But with the size of that tumor and with the portion of our conversation today that is posted out there, the audience will see the size of that tumor. That unfortunately, the surgery itself, they were able to remove only 35% of that. Because
is that because the rest was going into healthy tissue?
There's just parts of the brain that they cannot go into. The person just does not wake up, or they end up, in a vegetative state. There are 5 lobes of the brain. This tumor had spread into 3 of those. And so just because of where it was, there's limitations to what they could do. But I just wanted one thought on what you said. When you have cancer, you fight. Yeah. I emphasize that because the media incorrectly focus their attention on death with dignity. And sometimes the opponents will make it sound as if a person pursues medical aid in dying, that they've somehow given up. That couldn't be further from the truth. Brittany was doing everything she could to extend her life. But as I mentioned, doesn't matter if you're Senator John McCain. A GBM is very aggressive. And there comes a point where it's that recognition of, I have a finite amount of time left, and how do I want to spend that time? Do I want to spend it feeling shackled to a hospital because I'm constantly going in for treatments, the symptoms of which are many times worse than the disease itself?
Right.
And that's where Brittany said, no, I want to live the time that I have left.
I think also, from having watched all of the videos multiple times, and Brittany made a lot of videos on her own, I think that she looked so good in those videos. I think that what also may have happened in the public opinion is they looked at her and they didn't see a dying person. But as Brittany even said in one of the videos in her own words, she said, it really hurts me when people question that, like, I'm sick. She said, I may not look it, but I feel it. Like I see myself, I feel myself getting sicker every day.
Yeah, it is amazing how, as a society, a person will judge how sick a person is simply by their appearance. A brain tumor is in the inside of your skull. It's not going to manifest itself anywhere else. One thing about those videos, the timing of them, most of the first one was actually filmed sometime, I'll have to look back at the calendar, but it was sometime in August or September of the actual filming of those. By the time that second one was made, that was still like a good 3.5 weeks before this. So that was sometime in October. That was before Brittany died November 1st. So yes, the public would look at those videos, and in their mind they're thinking, oh, well, this person looks healthy, which is a strange thing to say of anybody who's going through, who has cancer. It's like, well, what does pancreatic cancer look like? Steve Jobs had that. And by the way, just as another example, Steve Jobs, I don't know what his position would be on medical aid and dying, but cancer, does not discriminate. You know,
Right.
you're talking about somebody who probably has more money than anybody in the world, Steve Jobs, and despite all of the resources at his disposal, pancreatic cancer still, ended his life.
Yeah.
And I just mentioned that because this idea that, there's always some magic cure just around the corner, and if you just wait, and there's 15,000 people every year that die of a brain-related cancer.
Mm-hmm.
In total, cancer, it's the second leading cause of death. Cancer is. It's about 585,000 deaths every year in this country are cancer-related. So that idea that, if we just hold on and there might be something for Brittany or for John McCain or from, no, we've gotten really good, and I take a moment. The advances that we've made in medicine, if not for those advances, those numbers would be significantly higher.
Yes.
So the physicians, nurses, clinicians, the researchers, everyone involved with making strides in caring for cancer patients and in some cases defeating the disease, depending on what the patient has. Those are wonderful, and I celebrate all of that. But it is also just a recognition that, with 585,000 deaths every year, we also just need to make sure that people aren't suffering needlessly.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because also on my Facebook page, I didn't print it out, but also on my Facebook page when I posted about this, another woman said something like, because I explained, Brittany took advantage of Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, blah, blah.
Sure.
I told this just a little snippet of the story. And she said, no, Tara, nobody has to die of cancer. If you live a certain way. And I said to the woman, because again, it's just so confusing. I said, look, at this point in her life, she had a stage 4 glioblastoma. There were 6 months at the most. There was, at that point, there's no cure. There is none. Death is the outcome.
Right.
And so it becomes a question of, how is that going to go down?
Right.
And so I think the mistake people make, and I don't think they mean to, is that they understand portions of the story and then they make judgments based on that. That's why I wanted to do a full show where you could tell the whole story so people just could understand it. We don't have to change anybody's mind,
No.
but just let people understand why you chose what you did.
Yeah.
So then Brittany made the decision to use medical aid in dying after that MRI scan came back and basically put her at stage 4. Is that correct?
She made the decision that we would be moving to Oregon so that she could apply for and have this medication. But again, the only thing she's pursuing and the only thing she made up her mind to do was to have that option. The hope is that she wouldn't need to use the medication. Truly. I mean, the hope is that hospice and palliative care would be able to keep her comfortable at end of life. But as I mentioned, because we had the firsthand experience of our friends' parents, their dying process did not go easy. And, I've since now spoken with a lot of individuals who they'll introduce themselves to me. It happened when I was in New Jersey just this past Monday, talking with legislators there. A terminally ill individual walks up to me, introduces herself. Hello, my name is fill in the blank, and I have stage 4 cancer. Fill in the blank: pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and it just breaks my heart, the fear that I see in their eyes of how their dying process might go. Because I remember seeing that same look in Brittany's eyes until we moved to Oregon. Because just having that medication, all of a sudden that fear, that terror that she was feeling of the idea that that brain tumor might torture her to death, just by having the medication, that fear vanished.
Right.
All of a sudden, Brittany recognized that she had taken back just a little bit of control
Right.
from the cancer, that she did not have to die the way that cancer would have ended her life. Instead, she could ensure that her dying process would be gentle. And it was, on that day, November 1st, she had a seizure that morning, and just a reminder of what she's risking. Because as I mentioned, at any point, if she suffers a stroke or things go sideways and she becomes paralyzed, the biggest safeguard, which I didn't mention this, but the biggest safeguard is that terminally ill individual has to be able to consume that medication on her own.
Okay.
The medication, just to demystify this for your audience, the name is, the medication is secobarbital.
Okay.
It's a sleeping medication. It's been around for over 80 years. So it comes as a normal prescription. There's 100 capsules. This whole process took us like 40 minutes. We had to open each of those capsules. The powder is emptied into a glass. That is then mixed with 4 or 5 ounces of water. And Brittany, the terminally ill individual, has to consume that medication on her own.
Okay.
Right. So that is something that, again, speaking to the safeguards and everything that is protecting that individual, that's the whole process. And so on that day, November 1st, within 5 minutes of taking that medication, Brittany fell asleep very peacefully, just like I'd seen her do 1,000 times before. And within 30 minutes, her breathing slowed to the point where she passed away. That is the dying process that this program afforded her, the ability to die in her sleep.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the way her dying process would have gone if that brain tumor would have continued to run its course. And as I mentioned, the symptoms that she was already suffering from, the seizures, the nausea, the vomiting, the inability to sleep for days on end, in a word, torture. That's how her days were. Every day is worse than the one before. That's the reality of what this program is. And what I mentioned at the Legislative House in New Jersey, where I was just a couple days ago, those terminally ill individuals who are now in Brittany's predicament, the first thing that they say after they introduce themselves is just how grateful they are to Brittany for having brought this conversation forward, and now our continued efforts to pass this legislation in more states, because they don't want to have to experience, the dying process that might be in store for them. They want to have that peace of mind.
Well, and to cap that off, Brittany went very public with this. And I have to tell you, I just found out, the bill went, the Death with Dignity Act was in Oregon as of 1997, correct?
That's right.
I'd never heard of it.
Right.
I'd never heard of it. I had never heard of any of this until Brittany came along. So what made Brittany decide to go public and kind of become like the reluctant face of the Death with Dignity movement? Because I know she wasn't someone who sought attention in that way, especially at this time of her life.
Right. And that just goes back to her personality. Brittany just felt it was a huge injustice that we had to cross some imaginary line on a map, that if we're in Oregon, she has this option to have a gentle dying process. If we stay in California, she runs the risk that things might not go that well for her. And she decided to speak up. That label of being the face of this movement, that's not at all what she, that wasn't the label she gave herself. That's what was kind of pinned on her.
Yeah.
But she recognized that it was actually October 6th of that year when all this media attention hit. When the first video was released, that article in People magazine, it was actually people.com, when they posted that, and then within the next day or so, it was on CNN and CBS and ABC and all these media people trying to contact us because they wanted to speak with Brittany Maynard. And so Brittany decided, she said that for 2 weeks she would allow the media to be a part of our world. But then after that, she said, we shut this down and we go back to family time. So those were the limits that Brittany said, okay. She was trying to, as they say, be the change that you want to see.
In the world,
that's
yeah.
what she was trying to do. And so she put herself out there, but it wasn't easy. She was very uncomfortable during the last few weeks of her life. Brittany wanted to live for 2 dates in particular. One was to celebrate our wedding anniversary, and that was September 29th. So for Brittany to make it through the month of September was her really tolerating a lot of discomfort and everything that, the symptoms that she was struggling through. The second date was my birthday. My birthday is October 26th.
Okay.
So for her to make it through the month of October, was really those seizures, the intensity of those, and everything she was suffering from were just getting worse and worse and worse. And so, those were, as much as she could, she wanted to be able to celebrate those two
Yes.
things, which, Brittany died on November 1st. So that was kind of, as she struggled for those last few weeks of her life, she also decided to take this on to advocate publicly,
Right.
to say that terminally ill individuals should not have to go through what we went through, what she went through, but we as a family of having to move to another state. So yeah, that's what led to all of this attention on Brittany Maynard. That was her personality.
And what we actually have the first video. She launched an online video campaign with this wonderful nonprofit called Compassion and Choices. And Compassion and Choices is an end-of-life choice advocacy organization that fights for expanding death with dignity laws nationwide. And as you said, this was posted on people.com on October 6th, 2014, first thing in the morning. By that afternoon, according to Barbara Coombs Lee, the president of Compassion and Choices, by that afternoon, 16 million people had seen that video, and it broke all kinds of records. And so this is the video that launched the campaign.
The thoughts that go through your mind when you find out you have so little time is everything that you need to say to everyone that you love. So after getting married is when I first started experiencing the headaches, and they were quite severe. And I didn't understand them because I had never had anything like that before in my life. Right when I was diagnosed, my husband and I were actively trying for a family, which is heartbreaking for us both. And then I was diagnosed this past New Year's. We went away to the wine country for kind of a New Year's Eve celebration, and by Jan 1, the following day, I was diagnosed with cancer and told I was terminally ill. I was told I had a grade 2 astrocytoma, and was told anywhere from 3, maybe 5, up to 10 years to live. I have to tell you, when you're 29 years old, being told you have that kind of timeline still feels like you're being told you're gonna die tomorrow. 70 days post-op, I went in for another MRI and was told I had had a grade change. They were looking and saying it looks like grade 4, which is the worst and most aggressive form of brain cancer. It's called a glioblastoma. So that was a major shock to my system and the system of my family, because it went from having potentially years of time to being told I had like 6 months. My parents spent a couple months, they just wanted to search for a miracle. I don't wake up every day and look at it. It's in a safe spot, and I know that it's there when I need it. I plan to be surrounded by my immediate family, which is my husband and my mother and my stepfather and my best friend, who's also a physician, and probably not much more people. And I will die upstairs in my bedroom that I share with my husband, with my mother and my husband by my side, and pass peacefully with some music that I like in the background. I can't even tell you the amount of relief that it provides me to know that I don't have to die the way that it's been described to me that my brain tumor would take me on its own. I hope to enjoy however many days I have left on this beautiful earth and spend as much of it outside as I can, surrounded by those I love. I hope to pass in peace. The reason to consider life and what's of value is to make sure you're not missing out. Seize the day. What's important to you? What do you care about? What matters? Pursue that. Forget the rest.
So that was your wife, Brittany. And I want to explain to people when she said, I don't look at it, what she's referring to is the medication.
Yeah.
She had filled the medication and just kind of put it aside.
Yeah, like
Just-
I said, that was
yeah.
never our focus. For her, it's like,
No.
okay,
Yeah, she's
I have this, and that's it. Now I focus on living life.
right.
And just the relief. A note on that, and to talk about the kind of the data from Oregon. We now have 20 years of data from Oregon. Every year they have to publish an annual report of the
Okay.
number of individuals that receive the medication and end up utilizing the medication. The numbers that stand out to me, for starters, it ends up being 0.3% of all deaths in Oregon. So it's a fraction of a percent.
Okay.
Just for those that are kind of latch onto the data of things, the state of Oregon has 3.5 million people. Every year there are about 35,000 deaths of all causes. In Oregon, the number of individuals, I think last year it was 136. So 136 individuals who went through this process of applying for and getting this medication and then ending up utilizing it. That 136, as a percentage of that 35,000 total deaths, that's where that number of 0.3% of
Right.
all the deaths are individuals who find themselves in this predicament. So this is very narrowly focused. This is not broadly used. But the one thing that does stand out is that over the last 20 years, more than a third of the individuals who qualify for and receive the medication, more than a third don't end up utilizing it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
They have it. They just like Brittany, they received it and they have the medication, but they end up dying of their underlying disease without needing to take the medication.
Right.
It provided that individual with that sense of relief that they have it, that little bit of sense of control, taking back from the chaos that cancer brings into your life. But that the third of the individuals over 20 years, they don't end up needing to use it. That to me just speaks to getting back to this being an option.
And did you hear what Brittany said? The part of the video that I focus on is when she said, I can't tell you the amount of relief
Right.
it gives me. I don't know if she used the word relief or comfort,
No,
but she just said,
relief,
I cannot tell you. I mean, don't we want to give that to a dying person? Where's our compassion? Like where is our humanity, if you will? Like, isn't it inhumane
Yeah.
to want?
And it goes along with this idea, and I've done this at different palliative care conferences that I've spoken. If you were to ask just the general public, given your druthers, when you're dying, how would you want that to go? How would you want your own death to play out? Most people say, well, I would want to die in my sleep, not even aware that it happened. It's just,
Right.
You just don't wake up. The most peaceful thing that any of us could think of is like, yeah, I passed away while I was asleep. Well, that's what Brittany got. She died in her sleep. Unfortunately, in her case, we had to go through the extraordinary measures of leaving our home so that she would qualify for Oregon's, this program and have the medication. But it truly was that medication that allowed her she fell asleep, as I described, very gently, and then her breathing slowed and she passed away in her sleep. And so what you're saying as far as where is that humanity or that compassion, that's all that, Brittany was striving for, to have a gentle dying process instead of struggling
Suffering.
horrifically
Yeah.
with what that tumor was going to do to her. So
It almost seems inhumane to put a human being through that kind of suffering. I don't understand that.
to insist it upon somebody else, because that's the thing. If somebody, for their own religious beliefs, or if somebody, if to me,
Jan's camp, yeah,
whomever,
yeah.
yes, to me that the term, and we can talk about this, the terminology, medical aid in dying is a term that you'll hear me use just to describe this.
Yes.
The name of the law in Oregon is called the Death with Dignity Act in 1997 when it went into effect. But to me, that idea of a dignified death, it truly is an individual thing. If there are individuals who, as the one individual who wrote the comment on Facebook, if for her a dignified death is, navigating as best she can, with hopefully some sort of relief from pain or suffering, but navigating that the way that, to her, within her own sense of spirituality and with working with her physician and with the support of her family, that term dignified death, it's something different for each person. And so if that individual would want to be hooked up to a ventilator or whatever they have in mind for themselves, then I would be the first one to defend that individual and say, no, you need to do what is right for that person.
Right.
In the case of Brittany, because of what, the amount of suffering she was already enduring, but what was coming for her, as it was going to get worse, for Brittany, that dignified death was the ability to not have to endure going blind, becoming paralyzed, essentially dying as a suffering mass, stuck in bed with tubes coming out of her.
In a hospital.
Potentially in a hospital, in a clinical setting. But even if it's at home, the body's still draining fluids and stuff, so and you can't move the individual out of the bed. So for Brittany, her, the death that she wanted for herself was one where she's not suffering and where it's peaceful, where she can look around the room and say, I love you, to the people who are important to her, and then pass away gently. The impact that, endings matter. And Brittany's ending, she wanted it to be one where she had a little bit of say as to how her final few days played out on this green earth. And
as it should be.
Yeah.
Well, and to corroborate that, I know my mother had a very long, protracted illness, and she didn't have the physical suffering that Brittany, she didn't have headaches and things, but she lost all quality of life. And at the end of her life, what was likely going to happen, because she had progressive supranuclear palsy, which is in the Parkinson's family, is she was going to lose the ability to swallow. And she signed something that she refused a feeding tube. So essentially, she was doing, everybody should have the right. My mother, she was like, I don't want a feeding tube. If I can't swallow food and water and drink, I'm not doing it.
Keep me comfortable.
I'm not doing it.
But allow me to pass away.
So I don't really understand why someone like my mother would have the right to sign away, I'm not going to take a feeding tube, which is essentially guaranteeing death within a few days, versus Brittany saying, I too don't want to suffer. This is just what I
Right. And in her case, it was just a different disease. It was cancer.
Right.
So it wasn't going to be that,
she might have lost her. Yeah.
If she does suffer a stroke, like I said, depending on what part of the brain is damaged, a person can lose the ability to swallow. And so in that case, but because she wanted that option of medical aid dying, therein lies the risk. Since she has to be able to consume that medication, if she does suffer a stroke and loses the ability to swallow, all of a sudden she would be stuck dying the very way that she was trying to avoid, because she has to be able to take that medication on her own. So, that is obviously factors into the decision of, I'm going to live these days as long as I possibly can. And then when we made the decision to move to Oregon, that's what Brittany was saying. It's like, look, I'm going to keep fighting, but I just want to make sure that I have this option should it become necessary.
Which leads me to my next question. She she picked November 1st. November 19th. Yes, November 19th would have been her 30th birthday. So my understanding is that based on the videos and things that you've said, I've seen you say on videos, she picked November 1st for that very specific reason, that the fear that, look, if I push it too long, I don't know if I'm going to be able to administer because...
Correct. And that is accurate, and I appreciate that. A moment to clarify that, because the media made it sound like she had chosen November 1st and it didn't matter how she was feeling. That was just going to be the date. That was incorrect.
Okay.
She voiced that date of November 1st as a goal to make it, to see if she could live to November 1st and beyond, if possible. And like I said, the milestones that she wanted to get through was to celebrate our anniversary at the end of September, and then at the end of October, celebrate my birthday. So it makes logical sense that she would say, well, let me see if I can live to November 1st. I'll keep going if I can, of course. The media took that and they twisted it around to make it sound like November 1st, doesn't matter, what's going on. Well, Brittany, what was guiding her decisions, the logic of her decisions, is how she was feeling, how those symptoms, were playing out. And every so often when we'd go in to have a scan, and we would see in the MRI, how is this tumor progressing? And so between the physical, the results of those MRIs, but then also how she is feeling day to day, that is what was dictating, how many days she had left. That November 1st was a goal to make it to that day. It just so happened that November 1st was the day that she died. But I just wanted to clarify, it was not how the media was portraying it, that it didn't matter, how she was feeling. November 1st was going to be the date. That was incorrect.
Did Brittany ever have second thoughts? Because I can imagine that the sense of relief I can completely understand. I get that completely, because I think that the terror of the suffering is what would be so horrifying. But as the time drew near, as we're now on October 31st, so 4 years ago tonight, October 31st, I know she was thinking tomorrow might end up being the day. Did she ever have second thoughts that she expressed to you?
No, and the reason, again, was that she's the one completely in control. So if that day, November 1st, and she mentions this in that the second video that she made, is that she says, if that day comes and depending on how she's feeling, then that would be the day that she passes away gently. But if November 2nd comes and she's doing okay, well, then we continue. We continue living life, focusing on the things that matter, that are important to her. So again, that idea that her hope is that she doesn't need to utilize the medication. But what's the other side of that is, every time she has a seizure, or every time there's a new scan and we see how much that tumor is progressing, she is running that risk that things, something occurs and then she loses the ability to self-administer, to take the medication. But really, during those last few weeks, the progression of what she was suffering, it just continued getting worse. I truly do think that none of us remember the day we're born. We're too young. There's no there's no memory of it. But I do think that when an individual is in their dying process, you and I were in our living process, if I could use that term, otherwise healthy, and we go on about our days. But especially when you're diagnosed with a cancer, ALS, diseases that you can physically tell that a person is indeed they're in their dying process.
Yes.
I think within each of us there is that recognition that and the medical community can see, yes, the organs are shutting down one by one if a person is really at the last final stages of their life. And so that was Brittany's reality, that she was in her dying process. Would she have lived another week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks had she not died November 1st? Yeah. And Brittany and I talked about that. And it is this idea of, are you leaving potentially a certain amount of time on the table, on the day that you decide to take it? But again, that gets back to it's a matter of quality of life, not just quantity. To say that, oh, well, this individual lived until whatever date, November 10th, if Brittany had died on that day, it's like, yeah, but what was those last 10 days like?
Yeah.
Was she even conscious? Well, she was sedated, or again, she was partially paralyzed. She had already suffered an enormous amount of discomfort and pain just making it to November 1st. And so Brittany simply avoided really, the worst of what was coming for her.
And when you guys awoke on that day, I've heard her say, just like, and you've echoed in interviews, because she even said in the second video that she did, if November 2nd comes and I'm still alive, we'll just carry on as a family. And when November 1st came, so the day began with a seizure.
Yes.
And at what point, I think you even said in one of the videos, you even said by that afternoon, we just kind of knew.
Well, she knew.
She knew.
She said, Dan, it's my time, and that's okay. I'm okay passing away, dying today gently, versus that seizure that morning was a reminder of what could take place, and in the blink of an eye, all of a sudden things change, and then she's in a really bad predicament. So, that's something I didn't want to hear that, but I understood. Selfishly, there's no way that I could say to her, well, those seizures you've been suffering from, and you haven't slept for a few days, and
the headaches,
the pain and the nausea, keep doing that. Do that for another 2 days, 3 days, a week. Do it for me. No, how in the world could I be that selfish to say or to insist that she needs to continue suffering on my behalf? So yes, while I miss Brittany every day, and back in those last few weeks in October leading up to November 1st, I remember how emotional that was for her and I, and we would be up in the middle of the night when she can't sleep, and we'd talk about everything, how everything from what comes next after this crazy world, from a religious or spiritual aspect, is there heaven? Are we just dead and you're buried in the ground? What comes next? From that to just living day by day. Every day we would wake up and I'd ask her basically 3 questions. How did you sleep last night? How are you feeling right now? And what do you want to do today? The answer to the first question I typically wouldn't know, because if she was up that night, getting sick or not able to sleep, restless and pain, I would be awake right there with her. How does she feel that morning? Yeah, at times she would say, Dan, sometimes she could kind of predict when she felt that a seizure might be coming on.
Okay.
So she'd say, keep an eye on, because it feels like I might have a seizure today. And then the answer to the third question, what do you want to do today? It seems so basic, but it truly was, or cliche, this idea of you take it a day at a time. So whatever Brittany wanted to do that day, that became my goal. If she said, well, let's see if we can maybe take the dogs for a walk, or she would want to go downtown Portland, a different part of the city, and just maybe take a little drive around or explore, then for me that became, let's see if we can accomplish that. The hope being that night, when we're laying back down to go to sleep, if we were able to keep ahead of the pain she was feeling with the medication, and if we were able to accomplish some of the things that she wanted to, then that was a good day. And I would tally that as, okay, we were successful today.
Right.
This was a good day. By contrast, on a day where if she suffers through a seizure, that's it. That whole day, we're pretty much stuck on the couch, and maybe we'll try to watch a movie, but she's in pain, she's uncomfortable, we're now, she's maybe nauseous, and then that becomes the day, and it's like, shit, that
That's
was
okay.
not
Yeah.
a good day. And you do just take it a day at a time. So yeah, the November 1st, there wasn't this feeling of doom and gloom or anything.
No,
It
when
really
you
was just Brittany. She's again. It alleviated so much stress because she was the one in control. She found a huge amount of relief in that. And of course, now as I look back, I recognize how much stress and anxiety that took away from me. My role is to be supportive of her.
right.
Whereas I've spoken with I've spoken with individuals who they lost a loved one. And the dying process that their loved one went through was not a gentle one like Brittany's. She was struggling to make it to November 1st. There was a lot of pain and discomfort she was
Right.
dealing with. But I'm talking about individuals who those final few weeks actually played out for those individuals that died in a pretty horrific way. And the family that's left behind, they look at me and they say, you don't know how lucky you are, because
You didn't have to watch it.
not only watch that, but the amount of guilt that they feel that did we do everything we could have? Should we have whatever medication she was on, increasing the dose? They really struggle with that, and I look back to Brittany's dying process, and what struck me on November 1st, after Brittany died. Really, one of the first thoughts was, we should all be so lucky to have that as your final dying process.
Yeah.
She wasn't struggling, blind, paralyzed, and I'm not making that up. That literally is how speaking with family members or individuals who lost their loved ones, that is the dying process that their loved ones went through. And, Brittany, because of her determination, she did alleviate a lot and took a lot of, that stress just out of the equation, because she was one in control.
On that day, I know that you were there, her mom, stepfather.
Brittany there was 3 other friends and my younger brother. So yeah, she referred to it as her circle of love.
Yeah.
And we were there for her. It's the acknowledgement that death is a part of life. Death is a part of living. That's the other thing, Brittany's message, I think. It just kind of brought up this conversation that we should be okay talking about death. It will happen to each and every one of us.
People get so uncomfortable.
Right, but
Yeah.
it shouldn't be. It is the one thing that is guaranteed. And so the way to demystify it and make it not so scary is talk about it, have the conversation. And in doing so, all of a sudden, it becomes less scary. And ensuring that your death can be a good one. I know that might sound like a weird term, but no. You live a good life, a good death is just the conclusion of
Right.
having lived a good life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so when she took the medication and then just passed peacefully, and
Yeah, she fell asleep within the 5 minutes, and then in 30 minutes her breathing slowed to the point where she died, and died gently,
yeah.
in the manner that she wanted, and not the way that what the brain tumor was going to do to her. And,
Right.
That.
She, in one of her videos, I thought it was interesting because Brittany explained why terminal sedation was not something that she wanted. And again, that's something that was offered to her, and that scared her, and I understand why it scared her. Can you explain the difference between terminal or palliative sedation
Sure.
and aid in dying? And
Yeah.
express why Brittany was scared, because I don't blame her.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
terminal sedation or palliative sedation, the terms are used interchangeably. That is a medical practice that is available in all 50 states. Terminal sedation is the medical practice of putting a person essentially into a coma
Okay.
and then withholding food and water until that person dies, essentially of dehydration. Not so much starvation. Dehydration, the organs start shutting down, the sedation itself. So that practice, and again, I have to be careful that I'm not being too critical of it, because at least the medical profession has that, and so I'm not criticizing that is an option. In most cases, that will hopefully provide a gentle dying process for those individuals. However, I've seen terminal sedation firsthand. This was an individual, a friend of mine. Her name is Jennifer Glass. Jennifer Glass had lung cancer that had spread to her spine, her pelvis, and her brain. She was an advocate and wanted the option of medical aid in dying, but she lived in California. This was in 2015, before the law passed. And the cancer had progressed to the point where her medical team, and she's in San Mateo, California, which is right outside of Palo Alto. So between Stanford and UCSF Medical Center, this is top-notch care. So I don't want anyone saying, oh, well, maybe they just didn't do it right, or her medical team wasn't skilled enough. No. Just like Brittany's case, top-notch medical care. And so the only option available for Jennifer Glass, when she basically turned to her medical team and said, hey, the protocol you have me on, it's not working. She's still suffering, uncomfortable. She's now experiencing a lot because the tumor was in the brain, a lot of the same symptoms that Brittany was. And so the only option available to her was terminal sedation. And so she said, well, that basically agreeing that, well, that's what we're going to have to do. So Jennifer's dying process took 5 days. I went to see her. It was a Tuesday, I believe, August 11th, I think, 2015. And I saw her that morning. I went to visit her and her husband. And Jennifer was in her bed, unconscious, essentially withering away. She had not had anything to eat or drink for 5 days. She died later that night, but on that morning where I went to see her, the promise is that, no, we can keep a person comfortable using terminal sedation. In Jennifer's case, on 2 occasions during those 5 days, she actually started coming out of the sedation, eyes wide open, arms flailing, uncomfortable, clearly in discomfort. And, they rushed to get her sedated again. And by the time they have her sedated again, foaming at the mouth. And, so that promise of a gentle dying process using terminal sedation, it's a little bit more of an art than a science. They know the patient weighs this many kilograms, so we're going to keep administering these meds on this, on this schedule. And hopefully that individual will remain sedated and they pass away. Well, to me, that is...
that sounds barbaric.
Well, again, in most cases, that they can keep a person sedated, and so they really are not aware of that dying process. But as far as it pertains to Brittany, she started asking a lot of questions about, well, will I still know, or could I still hear? Let's start with the different senses. Will I still hear conversations in the room? Will I know what's going on? And the response was, well, we can't definitively say one way or another. You're unconscious, but the sense that you're hearing, maybe you can. She says, would I suffer a seizure even though I'm unconscious? And they said, the seizure, because they've slowed electrical activity in the brain, you're probably not going to suffer through a seizure. Okay. What about a stroke? The tumor has its own blood supply. I mean, this thing was massive. And they said, oh, yeah, that we can't guarantee. You may suffer a stroke. She says, well, if I suffer a stroke, would I be aware that I had suffered a stroke? Will I know that I'm now somehow incapacitated even more or paralyzed? And they said, well, we can't answer that question. We don't know. So here's the thing. After seeing that, what Jennifer Glass went through, and Brittany was otherwise healthy. Jennifer had done the chemotherapy and radiation, so her immune system was shot. And so, her dying process taking 5 days, it took 5 days. In Brittany's case, 10 days, 2 weeks, they couldn't say how long it might take in Brittany's case. But after I saw that, what Jennifer Glass went through, utilizing terminal sedation at the advisement of her medical team, that's the option that they had, it dawned on me that the day that Jennifer Glass agreed to terminal sedation, that's the exact same thing as the day that Brittany agreed or decided to utilize medical aid in dying.
Correct.
The end result is death. They are not going to wake up Jennifer Glass. They're not going to. They will not stop administering those medications to keep her unconscious until she is dead. So the day that Jennifer decided that she would undergo terminal sedation, that essentially was the last day of her life.
Yeah.
The last day of her conscious life. Her dying process took 5 days. So to me, the question is, shouldn't that then be up to the individual? Shouldn't Jennifer have the ability to choose for herself if she would prefer terminal sedation? Then that's fine. Again, respect what the patient wants. On the other hand, if she would prefer the option of medical aid in dying, like Brittany had, so that the dying process is much shorter, well, then that patient should have that option.
I feel like, Dan, people are getting caught up in terminology that's freaking them out and that's upsetting them and that's making them think certain ways, because what you said is the crux of the situation. They both made the decision to stop their lives on a certain day. Jennifer's death just took 5 days.
Right.
Brittany's took 30 minutes.
Right. Yeah.
And
And each of them with cancer and each of them suffering at end of life. So again, this idea that, we're playing God or not. No. The only thing that Brittany's doing is avoiding suffering. The medical community, of course, is trying as best it can to
Right.
to keep any of us from suffering. But if I could, though, because this is kind of on that topic of the terminology, because the opponents like using the term suicide. They can't get enough of it. They try to apply that term suicide or physician-assisted suicide to this. The term suicide is neither appropriate nor applicable, really. Brittany wanted to live. A terminally ill, a suicidal person wants to die. So right away, we're talking about two really different groups.
Okay.
A person who is suicidal is a person who is depressed, despondent, making irrational decisions. Brittany was none of those things.
Right.
But again, the opponents will use that term because they know it's inflammatory and it scares people. A terminally ill individual that applies for this, Brittany is not choosing between living and dying. And that's the other thing when the opponents try to conflate this and make it sound as if it's a pro-life versus pro-choice issue. No.
Mm-mm.
The decision to continue living, that decision is not on the table for Brittany. By definition, she's terminally ill. That brain tumor will kill her, just like it did Senator John McCain, as an example. So Brittany does not have the luxury of choosing between living and dying. The only decision that Brittany is making is between two different methods of dying. One will be gentle, the other will be prolonged and struggling. So just to kind of help your listeners understand that this isn't a choice of her choosing, I can live or I can die. No, it's I'm dying. The choice that she has is limited. How is that dying process going to play out? So I mention that because it does have an impact on how
I
people
believe
see
that.
this.
I
When they hear that term suicide, it's like, that's a charged word. Well, that's why the opponents use it, because they know that it'll freak people out and make them tune out this conversation. But again, like I alluded to earlier, once I share, as I have today, so thank you, the opportunity, what Brittany was going through, the reality of this program, the safeguards that are in place, I think by and large, then people understand that, okay, now I understand, now I get this. And yes, if I was in Brittany's shoes, I'd want to know that I have that option too.
Right. And 72%, we're almost running out of time, but I want to get to some of this because I want to get people thinking. 72%, this is according to the latest Gallup polling, 72% of Americans are in favor of death with dignity or aid in dying. and it's legal only in 8 states.
That's right.
So, which is about 25% of the
20%.
20% of the U.S. population.
Yeah, those 8 states make up 20% of the population.
So my question is, all right, so I pretty much already know what you're going to say, but with the 28% that remains either opposed or undecided, is there a primary reason that they feel that this should absolutely not be passed in the legislature?
Yeah, and the primary opponent is the church. So the Catholic Church is the primary opponent. And I know I frustrate them because
You're
am Catholic.
Okay.
Like I said, a Catholic school, I was an altar boy, the whole 9 yards. So the Catholic Church, the leadership, so just to be clear, the leadership of the Catholic Church has a position of saying we're opposed to medical aid in dying.
Okay.
And of course, they'll call it, suicide. So the leadership of the church says that they're opposed. But interestingly enough, support amongst Catholics nationwide is 70%. So it's pretty much right in line with the general population. So
Okay.
as much as the church officially has their position of being opposed, the people I go to church with, the people that sit in the pews, they all agree with Brittany. And they say, no, a terminally ill individual should have this option at end of life. But yes, that is unfortunately where the where the opposition primarily comes from, is from the religious
And then
side.
it's inflamed by the terminology that
Yeah.
people use. Because you wrote in one of your articles how frustrated you were. You went to do work with legislatures, and one man, I don't remember his name, he actually came up to you privately and said, Dan, I support this and my wife supports this, but I'm not going to vote for it.
That was a legislator in Colorado.
And he said that to you.
Yeah. So he said that he personally, as well as he'd had a conversation with his wife, and he said, both of us are on board. I can't vote that way because of the pressure I'd received from my caucus. And that's so frustrating to hear that a legislator, instead of doing the job of representing his constituents, is feeling so much pressure from his caucus. He's like, I can't vote the way that I'm supposed to because, well, he's afraid that there'll be a referendum on his seat and then he'll get removed. So, yeah, that type of not.
Because the fact that he told you that, like, I couldn't believe he came up to you. When I read that, I'm like, well, kudos to him for because
right. There was a part of me who was like, I appreciate the honesty. Thank you, for just being forthright about this.
But Dan, what are we going to do? Like, here's what I don't understand. If 72%, which is the overwhelming majority, what are we going to do? I don't know what to do.
Well, so in the case of Colorado, we actually took that from going through it legislatively, and we took it to the ballot. So in Colorado in 2016, it was a ballot measure, and we took it straight to the voters there.
Okay.
That the thing with taking it to the ballot is that is a very expensive proposition. So in Colorado, that was like a $5 to $6 million endeavor. That Compassion and Choices primarily.
5 to 6 million?
Yes, that we had to raise the funds to collect the signatures, get it on the ballot, and then appropriately support it. That means the media educating individuals so that they know what they're voting for. And just a side note on that, the largest opponent that was running the ads, the negative ads against it, it was I believe their filing showed it was $1.5 million that the opponents brought forward to run their negative ad campaign. That $1.5 million came from the Catholic Church. So again, as a Catholic, it is frustrating that that's who I'm kind of locking horns with. But
these ballot initiatives, while they're expensive, it seems they're a little more effective because it gives the people the vote versus.
Well, no, I would say that going through the legislature. So to speak about now New Jersey and New York. In New Jersey, I was there on Monday.
Yeah.
And our hope was that we would have a vote on the floor of the assembly. We're now looking towards the next day on the legislative calendar where we can do that, and that will be December 17th. So December 17th, we're pushing the leadership in the New Jersey legislature to call the vote, allow the vote. We're confident that we have the votes to get it through the floor of the Assembly as well as the floor of the Senate.
Okay.
And if we're successful, then the bill will go to the governor. I had a meeting with Assembly members, with senators, and with a representative from the governor's office. They were productive meetings. I don't have an inkling, or they a lot of times won't share, how they're leaning one way or another. But my hope is that over the next, 6 weeks away or so, continue to have conversations, dialogue, and see if we can get the support, just like we did in California.
Okay.
When Governor Jerry Brown signed the legislation, that's what it takes. It takes our elected officials recognizing that they need to represent that 72% of the population. In New Jersey, I think the support is somewhat 63, 65%. So, still well north of 50%. So we have overwhelming support for it. And it's just a matter of encouraging or reminding legislators to represent their constituents.
I want to give a call to action. Supporters of Aid in Dying, who want to get help, with death with dignity bills passed in their states. What are some things? I know the BrittanysFund.org has a lot of information. I was actually poking around there last night. You can visit their elected representatives in their district. Like, what do you suggest we do? What can people?
So yes, to those hearing the sounds of our voices right now, is get involved with find out. You can go to the BrittanysFund.org. There's a button there that says "Take Action." It'll bounce over to compassionandchoices.org because both websites are hosted there by Compassion Choices. And right there, it'll identify who the elected representative of the individual might be. So whatever state you're in.
Okay.
And it's writing the letters. The emails are okay. The actual snail mail, so send it through the post office, those make an impact. And then it's also a matter of calling.
If you go to the Take Action, though, because doesn't it generate a letter? Like if you go to the BrittanysFund.org, and it's spelled BRITTANY,
correct,
the BrittanysFund.org, and you click on the Take Action, it will generate a letter for you. Isn't that correct? So
correct.
It doesn't take a lot of work.
No, it generates the basic email, and then the individual can customize it, and that's where we encourage them.
Okay.
Add the personal story. If you or a loved one is going through this right now, that is really what makes the difference. Because when a legislator hears from their constituent that they are the ones in Brittany's predicament and just want to have that peace of mind, that's what starts to win over those legislators.
And also making donations always helps. Because this is Compassion Choices is a nonprofit.
We're a nonprofit organization. Compassion Choices has been around for over 30 years, and that has worked in this space of end of life care. And much more than just medical aid in dying, but this is certainly something that is a focus. Mm-hmm. So yes, donations to compassionandchoices.org. Go to that site. They can click on donate. Yeah. The BrittanysFund.org also, if they click donate, the funds do go to Compassion Choices. So just to be clear, I had somebody ask me, was that money go to you and Brittany? No. This goes to the organization that Brittany partnered with. So that's what keeps us moving forward, and the ability to go to the state houses, to do all the lobbying that we do, through the generous donations of people who are supportive of this. So
exactly,
please go there. Yeah,
exactly. It was so nice talking to you. I want to give my little 2 cents. It's time for my Tara Marie's tip, and I wondered what I could add to this conversation. Last night, I'm thinking, what am I going to say? And the only thing that I can think of is that my whole show, actually my entire brand, is about living well, just as Dan and I were saying. It's about making choices and making decisions about your life that will give you the best experience of life that you can have. And I thought, as adults, we have 100% control of our lives, where we live, with whom we live, how we live, who we love. And generally in our life, we have control over the care that we take of ourselves. And as we said today, death is just a part of life. It's the period. It's the end of all of our lives, and how each of us dies and the circumstances of our death will be different, but death is coming to each of us. So I figured if we focus our whole lives on living well and as we would wish, shouldn't dying well on our own terms be a part of that? And I believe so. And I'm very grateful that at the end of Brittany's life, she was generous enough to share her experiences with the world to help us see that it's really a basic human right to both live and die on our own terms. And that was what I could add to this. I feel very strongly about this issue, and I'm just very grateful that you came today, Dan. It was so good to talk to you.
It's good to see
and
you
it's good
again.
to see that you're doing well.
Thank
It's
you.
good to see that you're doing well. You guys, that's all for our show. I'm glad that you joined me. I want to thank my guest, Dan Diaz. For more information about his advocacy work and to get involved with the Aid in Dying movement, again, visit thebrittaneyfund.org. And I'm going to spell Brittany because it's Brittany, thebrittaneyfund.org. There's a lot of information there, and you can take action with very, very little effort, really. Please rate and review Tamry Live on iTunes. We always love to hear from you guys. And be sure to subscribe to Tamry Live so you never miss an episode. You can subscribe on iTunes or whichever podcast app you like. You can do it right from my website, tamry.com. That's TARAMARIE.com. We post all episodes of Tamry Live on my website in case you've missed any. And when you're on Tamry.com, sign up for my mailing list. You'll get my newsletter with all my Tamry's tips. And I also keep you up to date on the show, who the next guest is going to be, and what we're doing. Make better choices today than you did yesterday, and you will always be moving in the right direction. God bless all of you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.